Can you see beasts, angels, and Hanukkah up on the screen right now? That's a pretty interesting topic, I think, to have as your title for your presentation. It's a little scary, I think, too, just to think about all these different things that are wrapped up into this one set of 14 verses. So I'm going to do my best not to go into verses 15 through the rest of the chapter, but there's just a big chunk of this that we just have to absorb here. So let's dive right in, and let's start with a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for our time that we have here just to pause for a moment and reflect back on some ancient history and also some future history. And we pray that you'll just help us to come out of this passage with a better understanding of really what your plan and what your knowledge of the nation of Israel would be going through, and help us to never forget some of the applications that we can have of this for the future. Thank you for our time in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, to dive through with this passage sort of takes us from chapter 7, where we were in looking at some visions that were there, and into a new realm of things where we go from the passage being in Aramaic and from one language, which was the language of the captives of really where Daniel was a mix of there, to the language of the Jewish people, to Hebrew. And I think we'll see why as we dive into this a little bit deeper here. So these prophecies are Israel specific, and they're, unfortunately for where Daniel was, they're about future sufferings. So the second vision, back to Hebrew. And remember, in a lot of the other visions and parts of what we have garnered through where we are here is multiple things come in multiple ways. And I think it's really neat for us to think about how Daniel was just an ordinary young man. There was nothing, he wasn't from some royal lineage or from some powerful, structure of families. He was just a regular guy. And I think when we get to the next passage after this next week, we'll understand his response to all of this and why that response was what it was. But all these visions were centered around some common thinking. One of the first, we had Daniel interpreting the king's vision in the beginning, which dealt around future kingdoms or was centered around that. And a lot of the parts that Daniel saw or Daniel interpreted there were similar to what we saw in chapter 7. And we also talked about before the lack of chronological order in the book of Daniel, how we jump around from chapter to chapter. But I think there's a purpose in the mix of things here that I think will become more evident as we get a little bit farther, even into the book. But tonight we're down here in Daniel chapter 8, and which actually chronologically happens between Daniel chapter 4 and really Daniel chapter 5. So both chapters 7 and 8 come in there and happen really out of the complete sequence of what we would think they were. And remember, before we talked about how the first 6 chapters of Daniel are a lot of history and a little bit of prophecy. And the last section of the book is a lot of prophecy and a little bit of history. And Daniel 7 was really about the global picture, the kingdoms of the world, the kingdom of Satan, the kingdom of Christ, and all of the real giant picture of the history of connected to the vision that Daniel had there. In Daniel 8, we have a national picture, really referring to the nation of Israel. And within the book, we're really brought in tune with 3 different characters, and then a 4th application to that as well, meaning that and in a way, we have 5 different characters within the book. We have Daniel the prophet, we have Cyrus the king of Persia, we have Alexander the Great of Greece, we have Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes, which we'll talk a little bit about him close to the end here. And then the application, or the I guess the extension of the future Antichrist, and comparing him to Antiochus and how that all comes together. With that being said, let's dive right into the text. And going into the text, let's see exactly how this all rolls out. And then after we look at the whole text, we'll come back and unpack the verses. So beginning in verse 1 of chapter 8, it says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first. And I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision, and I was at the Ulai Canal." So here we see sort of the purpose, the why, that there is a vision here, the place, the prophet, and the prophecy. So you have all of these things sort of rolled into the introductory part of this chapter. So, but we're going to focus on all of these areas as we talk through and work through the rest of the section here. Verse 3 says, "I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram charging westward, northward, and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. As I was considering, behold, a male goat from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground." In other words, the goat came in the vision moving across the face of the earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came to the ram with 2 horns, which he saw standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him with his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him, and struck the ram, and broke his 2 horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him. But he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him, and there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken. And instead of it, there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. And it grew great, even to the host of heaven. And some of the hosts and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. And it became great, even as great as the prince of the host. And the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offerings because of the transgression. And it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, "For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary, and the host to be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state." Now, that's 14 verses of a lot of information. There's some deep things in here, and even when we talked about this earlier, that there's just a lot of stuff here. I mean, it's almost like you could take each verse and spend a large amount of time looking at all the pieces of each verse. And I think the most unique thing to me about this passage is that all the pieces that Daniel was given in the vision came to happen exactly the way that Daniel said they would come to happen in the future. And everything that he describes here was in the future from the time that he received the vision. And that's an amazing thing, because you have Daniel, the regular guy, and I think that's why he says at the beginning, and the vision came to me, Daniel. Yes, me. And I saw in the vision, and yes, I saw. And he repeats that a couple times just to make sure that we understand that this is coming to him. And I think he was amazed that this was happening. And as you will see at the end of this chapter, it had a great effect on him. But with that, let's unpack the verses and go back through each one of them and take a quick look at where we are here. So first of all, the chapter begins in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar. Now, the Daniel chapter 7 was in what year? Yes, that is correct. The 1st year. Daniel chapter 7, it happened in the 1st year of the reign of King Belshazzar. And this is in the 3rd year. So this is like 2 years later. And this vision appeared to Daniel after that, what had appeared to him at the first. So he's making it clear that this vision came after the first vision. Just in case we didn't know there was a first vision, he let us know that this was the second one. So if we think time-wise, this is about 551 BC. And Belshazzar is the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. And he had sort of been given over the kingdom from his father, who was never really talked about that much. And I think Belshazzar was more like the outgoing, party guy, politician, based on what we've already studied about him and what happened back in the past. And he was also, not such a nice guy either in the midst of all of this. And if we were to look at a family tree, I know this is a little bit fuzzy, but this is the best one that I found that sort of laid this out, showing where Nebuchadnezzar was here just in the middle. And Nabonidus was Belshazzar's father or stepfather, depending on where you look at and which commentary you read. And he had sort of taken over things as he did within that time frame of his reign, whenever his ancestors had sort of turned that over to him, just for him to sort of carry along and be a part of the family line, sort of the royal line, as you might say. In verse 2, Daniel says, and I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision, and I was at the Ulai Canal. Now, this verse there's a lot in this verse, even though it just seems like, oh yeah, he saw a vision, he was in Susa, yeah, the citadel there, province of, yeah, it doesn't seem that complicated, but there's a lot here. First of all, the town or the place that he saw himself in was Susa. It was also the Hebrew name for that was Shushan. And if you have an older translation, you'll probably have the word Shushan written in as it is described there. But one of the neatest things about this verse is whenever he was having this vision, Susa wasn't more than a little wide spot in the road. And so the place that he was picturing himself in the vision was a place of future prosperity for that area. It was sort of a summer place that people would visit, that they would go there and spend time there. And it was a small, at the time that this was happening, that Daniel was seeing the vision in around 551 BC, Susa was not really on the map that much. It was not as significant. He also saw himself in the citadel, which the citadel implies a large structure. In our mind, we can think of it like a castle. And in the time that Daniel was seeing this, there was no castle. But he was given this vision as a time into the future, that Susa did become a very prosperous place. And I think for those of you who have really good memories, you know that we've studied about this place before. We studied about Susa whenever we went through the book of Nehemiah, and the events that happened with Nehemiah happened from the large city, and the events that happened there around Nehemiah the prophet, really where he departed from to go back and bring the people back, was in that area. Another thing that we know about Susa as well too is where Queen Esther, the whole story of Esther and the process that we know of that happened there, that happened in that same place. Another thing that he sees here is that he saw in the vision that he was at the Ulai Canal. In some of the older translations, you would see the Ulai River. And the truth of the matter is, Daniel saw himself in a place that was not in existence. It wasn't an actual river. It was a man-built canal, which we're going to look at a map of that here in just a minute. Which the amazing part about this is none of these things, existed in the place that they existed whenever Daniel saw them. So very unique that he mentioned these things and wrote these things the way that he did. The next verse, if we think about a little flashback here to Ezekiel, which Ezekiel was a contemporary of Daniel, and the vision that Ezekiel was given in chapter 8, Ezekiel talks about how he received this vision, and I think it's a little bit similar to how Daniel received his vision as well too, where he says, in the 6th year, in the 6th month, on the 5th day of the month, similar writing to Daniel, where he said in the 3rd year of, he wanted to make sure he established his time frame there. As he sat in his house with the elders of Judah sitting before me, the hand of the Lord God fell upon me. Then I looked, and behold, a form that had been the appearance of a man. Below what appeared to be his waist was fire, and above his waist was something like the appearance of brightness, like gleaming metal. These are the description of what Ezekiel was seeing. But here's the part that I wanted you to see. And he put out the form of a hand and took me by the lock of the head, and the Spirit lifted me up between earth and heaven and brought me in visions of God to Jerusalem, to the entrance of the gateway of the inner court and such. So I think in a similar way, God transported Daniel to Susa in the future. So just in case it hadn't occurred to you, God can function in time travel. This was before Doctor Who. This was before, we had science fiction movies about time travel, but Daniel was transported really as a vision into the future. And quite interesting how similar that could be to the vision that Ezekiel had, that I think God may have transported him in a very similar way. So if we were to think about this, here's a map of where Susa was located. Babylonia was up above here. And we can see some remnants some in this map where the Medes and the Persians were, based on the map, which we're going to look at that a little bit deeper here in just a minute. But Susa was here, and if you look at it a little bit differently, this is a closer view. The Ulai River actually ran just to the east of where Susa was. But in the city itself, if you were to, blow up this area where the Shushan or Susa actually were, there was a river, and if you can see my mouse, which I hope you can on your screen wherever you're looking at there was a river that came through Susa that ran around this way and sort of went around, whoops, I accidentally hit the mouse on there, and went around the main part of the city. So they wanted to divert the water to come into the inner part of the city where old Susa was at that time. And since the Ulai River was really over to the east of where this picture is, they named it the Ulai Canal. And in the process of studying sort of how this came to be, there were certain spots, and you can even see some spots on this map that looked like there were areas that whenever it flooded or came through, there was a lot of rain, that may have been much wider than what just a small, it was definitely bigger than the California Aqueduct, because if you've seen that, it's just, a few feet wide, where there's some places here where this may have been as wide as a football field or two. So a pretty significant body of water whenever there was a lot of rain during that time. And here's an actual picture, you know, from today of where the lower city of Susa would have been. The royal city was up here, and the Uli Canal ran pretty close to that in the area there. This is a picture of the Uli River and what the area looked like, or I'm sorry, really still looks like today, as a current picture of what the Uli River looked like. And you can actually go and do some looking on the country. And I know some of you might just be dying to go there. The country of Iran, where this is a part of now, you can get tours of the ancient city of Susa. And, you know, this reminds me of something like Daniel may have been thinking about the citadel. Citadel meaning a fortress or a castle type structure. And this is still present in the current city today. So if you think about this, Susa, or Shushan in the Hebrew, was one of the oldest cities in the world and part of the site that is still in Iran today. Excavations have uncovered evidence of continual habitation going all the way back to 4200 BC. And it was one of the main cities that grew out of the Elamite, Achaemenid, Persian, Parthian empires, and was really a very wonderful, thriving city at the time. And so Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and as I just said just a minute ago, Esther, and both Nehemiah and Daniel into the future actually lived there. Daniel was not there physically whenever he had this vision, but down the road he had spent time there as well. So a couple other pictures here. These are some pictures of where the city of Susa was, the old parts of the city. And right here in the middle of this picture, there were some discoveries of some really neat structures. And here is a statue that was found, that was unearthed among the midst of the ruins. And when you look at it, I think this is a statue of Darius, if I'm not mistaken here. My brain has left me, COVID brain, I call it. But, you know, that looks like a nice statue. And, you know, if you look at it a little bit closer, you start to realize that there's a lot of inscriptions on here. In other words, this statue tells a story. And if you look at it even closer up, you can see all the different hieroglyphics, or the different forms of language that's written here, even on the weapon that's really even on the statues, around the statue's belt there. So a lot of things have been discovered in that city that connect even the rulers that are talked about in Scripture all the way up until the current state. And quite interesting, a lot of the colorful things, as in this type of art that have been discovered there. This is a current picture of what the city looks like. And but believe it or not, there are areas here of historical significance. And I believe Daniel is even buried here. The location where his burial spot was in that same area. So with all that, that was a sidetrack of Susa and the history back in behind that verse where we were looking there. But diving back into verse 3, Daniel says, "I raised my hands and saw and beheld a ram standing on the bank of this canal. And it had two horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other. And the higher one came up last." So first of all, once again, Daniel is seeing this. He saw the ram on the bank, which is definitely different from the next animal that we're actually going to view here. And as we've already talked about before, the ram with the two horns really related to the Medo-Persian Empire. And when we think about that in a really simple sense, the Medes and the Persians united as a part of their desire to capture the rest of the world really at that time. And in the beginning, the Medes were probably the stronger of the group, but over time, the Persians really became the stronger, and that's why the other horn rose up, but rose up last. It came up last. So the Persian horn representing the Persians rose higher than the other horn, and it rose after the first horn. So that's a part of, I mean, it's really interesting to think about the fact that Daniel got this through the vision that God gave him. But I mean, really, should it really surprise us? No, because he's having this vision from the one that knows everything. So, and as I've said many times in the past, in a question form, did it ever occur to you that nothing ever occurred to God? Because he knows everything. And the person that knows everything is the one that's telling Daniel this. So the Persian Empire grew greater over a period of time. But the next part of the vision sees the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him. There was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. Mainly Cyrus the Persian is the main leader that drove a lot of this. And this empire spread mostly west, north, south. It conquered all during its time, and they really ruled their part of the world. And if you were to think about that, the Persian Empire, and just for a little sake of looking here, the yellow, the sort of, I don't know, greenish yellow sort of gives the extent of what that looked like back in the day, where the Medes and the Persians grew, spread west, and from where the Medes are, they actually even spread some north, some south of there. And that was the massive expansion of their growth. And that was pretty significant back then. And even a part of what they took over was this Neo-Babylonian Empire. And in the end, the bulk of what we see, all the colors here, was a part of the Persian Empire, because they took over the Babylonian Empire. They took over Lydia in 547. They took over Egypt in 525. All of these, and we've already talked about the night that the writing came on the wall in 539, and Belshazzar was killed that very night, and the Medes came in and destroyed the area there where they were. And so all of this entire area here was a part of what they controlled. Moving right along, verse 5, as I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west. Oh, we have another animal, and it's a goat. He came across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. And God knew about hoverboards before we even had them. And this was like this goat was on a hoverboard flying across the face of the earth. So not only is the goat strong, coming from the west, and we know what's west of where we are, Greece, that whole part of Eastern Europe is from the west. And as he traveled without touching the ground with great speed, the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. So Daniel was seeing this. He was seeing the male goat coming from the west. Greece is in the west, in case you're thinking map-wise, very fast. And this represented, of course, the conquering power of Alexander the Great. And if you looked at this, the area from the west where this was coming from, whoops, I accidentally clicked it again, was coming from the west side of this map into the central part of this map. And Alexander the Great is known for his swift acquisition of power across what was known at that time of most of the known world. And he didn't slow down for anybody. He continued to take over areas, and he came and conquered all. And the interesting thing about this is that this map looks very similar to the previous map that we just saw. So the previous map and this map, which were the existence of where the world existed at the time, was a part of what he had conquered. Verse 6 says, and he came to the ram with the two horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in his powerful wrath. So the goat attacked the ram, and he did not attack the ram softly. he hit the ram hard. It's just like those, ram truck commercials where you see the two rams, butting heads together. But this was the goat attacking the ram, and the powerful wrath of the armies of Alexander the Great uh, did some pretty serious damage to the ram. And as a result of that, verse 7 says, I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against and struck the ram and broke his two horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him. But he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him, and there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Now, there's a lot of symbolism built within this passage here. But the idea was that the strength and the swiftness of Alexander the Great was no match for the Persian Empire at that time. There was no one that could really come to rescue or help or save the ram. It was really the empire of Alexander the Great that was in control. So in verse 8, it says, then the goat became exceedingly great. And I think it's pretty funny here that we use the symbolism even today in 2020 of the word goat, G-O-A-T, to stand for greatest of all time. And there's a lot of athletes out there who like to claim that they're the goat of something. And it's interesting in this passage that it literally says the goat became exceedingly great. But the next part of the verse is a really significant part where it says, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken. And instead of it, there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. So the goat became great, but not too long after he became great, the great horn was broken. And I think this is Daniel with the understanding that Alexander the Great, who was the main horn, did not live too long. He passed away at a very early age. And from that single horn on that goat, there came 4 horns. And those 4 horns, as we've already talked about before, were the 4 generals that were a part of Alexander's army. His son did not succeed him. And a lot of that probably had to do with his son was so young. I think he was barely over a year old at the time that he died. And that is something that has sort of, the 4 generals reshaped the structure of that part of the world for a significant period of time. You have the General Seleucus, who took over the Persian area and little corner of India over there, Ptolemy in Egypt. And then there was an interesting sharing of the generals of Greece, Asia Minor, Macedonia. Pergamum was taken over by Attalids. You can see the purple area there. So that whole area then just got split up between the generals. And from those areas, especially the Seleucus, the area, the Persian area, probably about, and depending on which commentary you read, either 7 or 8 generations later came a leader that we're going to talk more about here in just a minute. Why don't we talk about it right now? It's that verse. Verse 9 says, and out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. So out of one of those horns, and to back up here a second, which was the horn was the out of the Persian area, and some generations later, there was a little horn that grew exceedingly great. And not only did he grow in great power toward the north, south, east, toward the south and toward the east, but he also grew toward the glorious land. Now, glorious land was, of course, Israel. And this little horn was Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Now, we could do a whole lesson just on this guy. He was a mess. He actually gave himself the name Epiphanes because he believed that he was sort of like a superhero, a superpower, and that he was like the epiphany of the day. and he wanted people to sort of worship him just like he was God. I think he believed he was God. And that little horn that grew great is symbolic. And there were a lot of things that happened here that, as we will see, of things that are still to come into the future. Verse 10 says, it grew great, even to the host of heaven. And some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. Now, this host of heaven really connects to the nation of Israel, and the fact that and some of the stars. Remember how God told Abraham that he would become the father of many nations, and they would be as many as the stars in the sky. And I think this is sort of a connection to the fact that Daniel is telling us with an understanding that Antiochus Epiphanes became so great that he pushed his way into the land of Israel. And some notes that I have written down here is, the same king, or the little horn, clearly represents also in our future the final Antichrist. The reason are both described as little horns is because they're sort of prefigures of each other. A far more in chapter 11 coming up in Daniel, we'll have a greater description of this as we get out there into the future. Verse 11 here says, it became great. It, meaning Antiochus Epiphanes, even as great as the prince of the host, and the regular burnt offerings was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. Meaning that Antiochus Epiphanes came into Jerusalem and overthrew the regular practices of what went on in the temple. He took over the sacrifices. He stopped the regular offerings. And once again, it's very, very interesting how there are so many parallels between what we have here and what we have of future predictions of the future Antichrist. Verse 12 says, and a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of the transgression, and it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act, and it will prosper. Now, that verse, that is a doozy of a verse right there. But if you think about this, one commentary that I snagged the notes here on, it says, Judah's 3-year rebellion period, during which the temple would be defiled and prostituted to heathen youth, is described here in this verse. The phase rendered because of is somewhat ambiguous. However, this verse would probably fall together just like this. Here's another good way to think about this verse. This is almost like an amplified version of that verse that we just looked at. And on account of the transgression, presumably the transgression of Jason and Menelaus, the pro-Syrian faction among the worldly-minded Jews of the Maccabean period. In other words, there were some folks that were in leadership in Jerusalem that really didn't do what they should have done to stand firm, that allowed a part of this to happen. And the host, meaning the host of God's people, the Jewish believers, would be given up, meaning the persecuting power of Antiochus, along with the continual burnt offerings, and the horn, meaning Antiochus, will fling the truth, that is, of scriptural faith and service of God, to the ground by forbidding it on pain of death. And he will perform his will or carry out his program of enforcing idolatry, and will, for the 3-year period, prosper. Does that sound familiar? That sounds really familiar to the future and some things that we have read about, especially in the book of Revelation, about the future Antichrist. And if you think about that, there's a passage from Matthew chapter 24 that parallels this really well. And it says, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, and that abomination of desolation we're going to see in the next verse right out here in a second, standing in the holy place, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop go down and take what is in the house. Let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be a great tribulation, such as not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. So the connection of Daniel and what Daniel is saying here to a future Antichrist is even quoted in the book of Matthew. If you were to stop for a second and pause and look back and see what similarities that Antiochus and the future Antichrist have in common, first of all, they both began modestly, but increase in power and influence over a period of time. They both blaspheme God with mouths that speak great things. They both persecuted the Jewish people. They both claimed to be gods and put images in the temple. Both imposed their own religion on the people. Both are opposed by a believing remnant that truly knows God. Both are energized by the devil and are great deceivers. Both appear to succeed marvelously and seem to be invincible. Here's the best one. Both are finally defeated by the coming of a Redeemer. And the one that defeated Antiochus in the past was Judas Maccabeus, and in the future, it will be Jesus Christ. Now, if you think about that and think about where this passage is here, and I'll back up 1 second just to think about this for a second. The overall time frame of how this all came together when Judas Maccabeus came and finally defeated Antiochus, that defeat is what Jews around the world celebrate around the same time that we do Christmas time, which in our world today is known as the Festival of Lights, aka Hanukkah. So the interesting part about this is the defeat of Antiochus is still celebrated even till this day, every year, specifically by Jewish people around the world, because of the events that were connected to this person that long ago, even in the 2nd century BC, which that's pretty deep into what Daniel talked about right here as well too. Verse 13 says, "Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, for how long is this vision concerning the regular burnt offering and the transgression that makes desolate?" And that is the spot where Matthew was talking about that we just read from right there a while ago, and the giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled underfoot. And without going into a lot of detail, that whole abomination of desolation is when Antiochus specifically put on the altars in the temple area a pig, which was very, very unclean to the Jewish people, still unclean even to today. And in the process of looking at this passage that we see right here, Daniel sees one holy one speaking to another holy one. And the question that asks is, how long is this going to last? And one of the holy ones said to Daniel, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. So even in the mix of this prophecy, Daniel even tells us here that the sanctuary will be restored. And it was restored in 168 BC on December the 14th by Judas Maccabeus, and that's the victory that Hanukkah is celebrated for. Now, this last verse can be, depending on which commentary you read, you can get a lot of different answers. But I did find one that I thought I would share with you that gives both views of this last verse as a description. So in this last little rendering here, there were at least 2 and possibly even 3 holy ones conversing about the prophetic meaning of the vision that Daniel had just described. And apparently the second angel, and we know, and you will find out, and you will hear more about this, about who these were in the last part of the chapter here. And I'm not going to talk about that tonight because we'll save part of that for the next time. And as to the duration of the terrible period when the temple and the altar of the Lord would be desecrated, the answer given by the angel was that this condition would last for 2,300 evenings and mornings. Okay, what does that really mean? This period of time can really be looked at in a couple different ways. It was either as a literal 2,300 24-hour days, meaning evening and morning, meaning entire day from sunset to sunset. And there are folks that take a time frame of about 171 BC 170, going down to 164 as a time frame to get that a little over 6 years to make that fit within there. Or it could be 1150 days as composed of 1150 evenings and 1150 mornings. In other words, the interval would be either 6 years or 3 years, based on 6 years in a few days and 3 years in a few days. Most of the evidence seems to favor the later interpretation, because there was a specific takeover time by Antiochus from about 168 down to 165, which encompassed those 3 years. So most people believe that's the time frame that this was talking about, and that the idea of during that time was when the sacrificing was suspended, leading up to the time that Judas Maccabeus came in and defeated Antiochus. I know that's a mouthful. That's a lot of deep stuff right there. So how does this compare to where we are right now? How does this compare to the world that we live in? I don't know. Some things come out of interesting places. And this morning, and some of you, if you keep up with the daily bread, from the time I was a little kid, our family always read, Radio Bible Class, the DeHaans and all those folks. I'm sure some of you remember them quite well, read the Daily Bread. And my Daily Bread reading that I did this morning, right after I got up, had a passage in it that I thought, wow, this is just really perfect for the time frame that we live in. Because right now, if you think about all this stuff that Daniel was seeing, that he was visioning, and you will also see next time the result of what this did to him physically. It is stressful. So even today, 2020, dealing with COVID, dealing with leadership changes within our country and all this, sometimes we become overwhelmed with so much stress. But the reading this morning was rather amazing, and it all came from Psalm 28. And who else to calm our fears other than the psalmist himself? And here's what it says. To you, O Lord, I call, my rock. Be not deaf to me, lest if you be silent to me, I become like those who go down to the pit. Hear the voice of my pleas for mercy when I cry to you for help, when I lift up my hands toward your most holy sanctuary. So here we have the psalmist looking to the Lord as his rock and asking him, please listen to me. Please don't be silent. Please hear my voice. And he goes on in verse 3 and he says, do not drag me off with the wicked, with the workers of evil, who speak peace with their neighbors while evil is in their hearts. Give them according to their work and according to the evil of their deeds. Give them according to the work of their hands. Render them their true reward. And so, the psalmist is saying here, the world is really an evil place right now. And I need you to be the righteous judge on all of those situations. He's sort of giving that to God, knowing that it wasn't his job to give out rewards or punishment. Verse 5 says, because they do not regard the works of the Lord or the works of his hands. He will tear them down and build them up no more. Verse 6 says, blessed be the Lord, for he has heard the voice of my pleas for mercy. The Lord is my strength and my shield. In him my heart trusts, and I am helped. My heart exults, and with my song I give thanks to him. These two verses, if we could plaster these, somewhere and have an understanding that, God is the same today as he was then when the psalmist wrote this. But that's not the end. Here's the end. The Lord is the strength of his people. He is the saving refuge of his anointed. By the way, let me read that again. The Lord is the strength of his people. He is the saving refuge of his anointed. Oh, the psalmist says, save your people and bless your heritage. Be their shepherd and carry them forever. So I think with everything that we saw with Daniel and thinking about the future, and the idea of the future really is about the future sufferings that Israel was going to have to endure. both in dealing with the Medes and the Persians, and also, and remember, this happened before chapter 5. So Daniel had this vision before Daniel in chapter 8 occurred before chapter 5, and all of the things that happened within not too far much later within his lifetime. Only about 8 years after this vision happened did that happen, really from 551 to about 5, no wait, I said that backwards. It was from 551 to 539, so it's a little bit more than that. And the idea is that all of these things that were prophesied about the nation of Israel, we live in a world today where we are under the stress of all these different things going on. So just a challenge to you, if you're feeling down or go back and read Psalm 28 and read it twice, read it 3 times. And I think this psalm from so long ago can be medicine to us to help us think about that. So if we're thinking about a ram, a goat, future, all these different things that Daniel talked about, think about the king of Persia, Cyrus, Alexander the Great, Antiochus Epiphanes, and even into the future with the future Antichrist. There are some things out there that we may be called to go through, but never forget what David talked about in Psalm 28. Even though these beasts might be a little scary, remember that, God is great and knows all things. He's still the same today as he was in the past. And Daniel was given this gift to be able to share with us things that were even into the future, even from where we are right now. So don't forget that. And we will keep that up as we go through the future into where we can move through. So let's pause for a quick word of prayer and wrap it up. Father, thank you for our time that we have here. Thank you for just being able to share from your word, and know there's a lot of deep stuff there just for us to comprehend, but just help us to be able to know that you are who you say you are, just today, just as much as you were then. And the knowledge that you had, that you give to Daniel, you can help us through difficult times, just like you were able to share that knowledge with him. Thank you for our time we have this evening. In Jesus' name, amen.